Robertson. My partners are Jose Lopez, Tanya Hanel, and we'll be presenting on public partnerships and financing options. As the other groups mentioned, the City of Quincy, as the other groups mentioned, the MBTA closed the parking garage this summer due to safety concerns and presented the City of Quincy with a unique opportunity to revitalize the station and optimize the air rights. We saw the problem as a question of funding. Both the MBTA and the City of Quincy have expressed interest in revitalizing the station. However, due to budgetary concerns and fiscal restraints, neither entity is able to fund it solely. As a result, the City of Quincy is interested in entering into a public-private partnership that will help it achieve this objective. After conferring with the City of Quincy, we realized at the heart of any vision for the Quincy Center Station is the desire to create a station that celebrates the new downtown. And the intent is to create a partnership that will help the city accomplish this goal.
Okay, so these are the 5 goals that we developed for any partnership structure that's going to redevelop the Quincy Center Station. In particular, we focused on goal number 2. We played around with this a little bit and ended up choosing the phrasing of optimizing the private sector investment. This is primarily because as a critical gateway site where the MBTA has existing infrastructure in place, we found it important to take into account the market risks associated with maximizing the private sector investment. And goal number 4, a little bit about the background for this station is that the city actually owns the air rights above the station and the tracks. And so for that reason, they're able to dictate whatever gets developed at the site currently. And we feel like it's important because it's such a critical gateway to the city that the city maintain a role in structuring the future growth for any redevelopment that occurs. In working with the city, we met with them and they articulated 3 pretty clear criteria to us that any of the alternatives that we proposed needed to be vetted through. 1 is minimizing the financial risk to the city. 2 was minimizing the city's responsibility in the operations and maintenance for the long term for whatever gets built at the site. And finally, they were interested in maximizing any financial rewards from the air rights. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to present on an overview of the partnership models. We're also going to talk about the stakeholders and potential partners, the suggestions for alternatives and financing options. We have 3. And we're going to analyze the alternatives and present you with final recommendations.
Okay, so these are the 5 roles for in a public-private partnership: the design, the finance, the build, operation and maintenance, and ownership. At one point, public did it all, but now it's a combination of public and private filling in these roles. The City of Quincy does not want to sell its air rights, so private cannot own the site. Next, we have the spectrum of available public and private partnerships. This is not the entire width or breadth of all public and private partnership combinations. At one end, we have the very, very public combination, which is a design-build model. The city owns a site, it's privately built, the city finances it, and the city operates it. Next, we have 1 step up is going to be operation and maintenance model. The city still owns the site, it's still privately developed, but the city contracts out the operation and maintenance through a long-term lease. The private sector pays a concession fee for the right to operate and maintain it. And then after lease expires, ownership and responsibility transfers back to the city. Next, we have a build, operate, and transfer. The city still owns it, but this time the air rights are leased. It's still privately built, it's privately operated, but after a given time, it transfers back to the city. The financing can be a combination of either completely public, private, or a combo of the 2. Finally, we have a BOO, which is build, operate, own. Everything's private. The air rights are sold, it's privately built, and privately operated. The city can negotiate when it sells for first refusal, which means that if the owner decides to sell it, that they have to go to the city first with an offer and see if the city wants to buy it. Keep these in mind as Jose starts talking about stakeholders.
help us come up with recommendations, we reached out to various stakeholders in the community, and this slide shows the different folks we were able to contact to get information about. We found out that the city owns the air rights above the tracks, that it favors a private partner arrangement where it uses a long-term lease so that it can recover the property after an extended period of 30 to 50 years. Additionally, that would give the city the ability to shape the future of the Quincy Center Station. Another thing that was important to the city is optimizing the bus routes near the station so that traffic flow would be improved. We were able to find out a little about the community by attending a MassDOT meeting and talking to some of the people there. We did not get a sense that there was a strong interest in additional parking. There was some interest in bike-oriented development in the form of dedicated bike lanes and storage, and there was interest by the community in construction work in any redevelopment. The FTA spent money in the original construction of the Quincy Center Station, so we needed to determine how that would constrain future projects, and we found that the regulatory compliance period had expired in the parking garage, that there's 9 years left in interest in the station, and there's a permanent interest in the land adjacent to the station. What FTA interest means is that they need to approve any lease agreements, and any revenue generated needs to go back into transit. The Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development has currently been partnered with Streetworks, but we think that DCAM could also bring some expertise in the partnership. They're responsible for major public construction, and they can bring some maintenance and management expertise to a partnership with the city. We found out that the MBTA owns a parking garage and that they don't have any funds to contribute to any redevelopment, but they're willing to give up their stake in exchange for a remodeled station with at least 500 commuter spaces. We were able to get feedback from the Grossman Companies, a local developer, and they were skeptical about the market being able to absorb much more investment in the area. They were skeptical about the station itself supporting much retail because historically multi-level retail doesn't work outside of malls. They think housing or a hotel could work, provided that it complements the rest of the development. Obviously, the proximity of the station would be a selling point. We did not reach the National Park Service, but we heard from other parties that they may be a partner because they're interested in being part of the new Quincy and possibly having a new visitor center or some other kind of space, and they also have funds to contribute. Quincy College, we were able to reach them, and we found out that they're owned by the city, and they function as a department of the city, but they don't have any funds to contribute because they don't have an endowment with which to buy property, and they did not express a strong interest in additional parking. So with all this in mind, we were able to, it helped to shape our recommendations, and now Janina is going to talk more about different partnership arrangements.
These are 3 alternatives. The first one is a city-led stabilization. The example of this would be Wonderland. The next alternative is the other public. The example of this would be Union Station in Los Angeles, California. And then our last alternative is a private-led TOD project. The example of this would be North Station in Boston. And Tanya and I will go into more details about the alternatives as well as the financing options. The idea behind a city-led stabilization alternative is the city would stabilize the site by rebuilding the garage and renovating the station. This will allow the city to A, pause and think about future development, B, make the state so it's more presentable to the larger redevelopment.
So Wonderland was the example that we provided, but in thinking about the financing for a city-led alternative, we don't imagine that the redevelopment would be quite at that scale. The when a city has to finance a project on its own, it traditionally has to rely on either grant funding or leveraging bonds. The City of Quincy has already leveraged $290 million worth of bonds, and they've promised their general obligation funds. They also have leveraged special assessment bonds, and that's primarily to support the streetworks development that's going on. This project is not currently a part of the scope of the streetworks project, but we do think that there's some revenue that the city could dedicate to this site because it's such an important gateway to the streetworks project. So a portion of the bonding authority was through a special legislation called 121A that the city passed, and it's a new growth tax component that leverages bonds off of the portion of the new development that's going to occur in the streetworks downtown. 65% of that is dedicated to go to the infrastructure for that downtown redevelopment, but 35% of it is going back to the city. So that is available for potential funding for this site. Additionally, the city has been approved for $50 million through the I-Cubed program through the state, which is also bond financing that the state is leveraging from the streetworks development. Currently, its scope is for 3 major infrastructure projects in the downtown, including the Adams Green right outside of the station. So we think that a portion of, because of changes to that program, it's become a little more flexible, and we think that the funding could possibly extend to this 4th project. Finally, the city would be on the hook as opposed to the MBTA for rebuilding the garage at the site. So the city would have to leverage parking revenue bonds to do that. The one thing we want to point out is that this is a lot of responsibility for the city to leverage the financing, but perhaps more importantly, it's a lot of responsibility for the city to own and operate and maintain the site and whatever gets built there in the long run.
Our next alternative is the other public, and in this case, replacing the city in the partnership would be another public entity. The public entity would come in, rebuild the garage, renovate the station, and create a public space. As Jose mentioned, there are possible public partners, the National Park Service, for example. In Los Angeles, right, that would be Union Station right there. And then down here is the Metrolink, and the Metropolitan Water. All of their headquarters are based down there, and it's used to stabilize the Union Station.
So the benefits of financing alternative 2 from the city's perspective is primarily that the responsibility for financing it is shifted onto another public partner. This particular model doesn't rely on a strong market in order to provide some amount of redevelopment above the station. What we envision would be created is primarily an agency office space for either a state agency or the National Park Service. And this, we did consult with stakeholders. The National Park Service is interested in agency headquarters, and although the state can't comment much more than to say that this site does meet with the 6 funding priorities of the Patrick administration, we think it's an attractive TOD site for any state agency.
Our last alternative is a private transit-oriented development, and in this case, a private partner would provide the financing, would privately build it, and would operate it. An example of this is North Station. In North Station, Delaware North came in and provided financing for the widening of the the train waiting station, as well as paid for the right to operate the parking garage. Delaware North had a vested interest in North Station because, as you all know, it's directly under the TD Garden. In order for this to work for the City of Quincy, it has to be tied to a larger profit-generating project.
So in that vein, when you're envisioning alternative 3, the benefits to alternative 3 is not only does the responsibility for financing get shifted to the private partner, but the private partner has access to private equity, and it additionally has access to private debt. The only thing that we were concerned about in terms of leveraging private debt for this site is that in the form of mortgages and construction loans, that all needs to get repaid out of revenue that's generated from whatever gets built on the site. So one of the ways that the city could entice a private developer to the site might be to offer concession fees on the lease, zoning bonuses, density bonuses, performance bonuses, and then additionally, this does allow for the city to still use some of its public funding to focus on infrastructure and landscaping for the site. All right, so part why we've been talking a little bit about some hesitancy towards the private development is the idea of market saturation. So we want to give a little bit of background. This is a map of all of the different projects that are going on in this as part of the Streetworks development. So just in phase 1 alone, and 2 of the buildings are now under construction, there's going to be 400 new residential units within walking distance to the T station. Overall, there's going to be 1,200 new residential units of all sizes created in the downtown. 600,000 square feet of new retail space will be created, 100,000 new square feet of new food and restaurant space, 1.1 million square feet of office space, including space for a major academic institution, 2 hotels, a cinema, a health and wellness center, a 24-hour gym. We have a feeling that that's a lot for the market to absorb in downtown Quincy. It's a major redevelopment, which didn't include this site. So when we talk about market saturation, what we're thinking about is a pause to allow the market to absorb some of the redevelopment and stabilize. So now we're going to analyze some of the alternatives we've presented. First, we looked at it from the city's perspective. Clearly, the city-led stabilization does not achieve the city's goals of minimizing their financial risk or of their management responsibility. And finally, it doesn't exactly maximize on the air rights over the station. The one thing we would point out, however, is that it does stabilize the station and make it a better gateway for as the downtown Streetworks project is coming online. And it does leave the air rights open for the future, so they would still retain rights to the air rights. The other public, here all of the financial responsibility is shifted to the public. There's no management responsibility for the city, and in terms of financial rewards, even though they might have to offer lease concessions and they'd only be likely to lease the air rights over the station, it does offer some financial rewards to the city. Finally, the private TOD comes across the strongest in terms of shifting the management responsibility and creating the most potential for financial rewards. The only issue is in terms of financial risk. That private partner at any point could default either, or could back out if the market softens during construction or 10 years in. So then we analyzed it with a consistency with our goals that we created for the project and the redevelopment at this site. In terms of partnership structures, we think that the city's interests can be protected primarily through creating strong partnership agreements, and the City of Quincy, through this partnership with the Streetworks developer, has a lot of experience in terms of creating good partnership agreements. So we felt pretty good about that in any one of the scenarios. Obviously, the 2 publicly led alternatives are going to leverage the most amount of public financing, but we also want to point out that the privately led alternative could also attract some public investment because of the importance of the site. In terms of leveraging private investment, the strongest alternative is alternative 3. All 3 of the alternatives, we don't recommend that the city sells its air rights, and in maintaining the air rights through a long-term lease, the city maintains a stake in the site. Finally, in terms of consistency with the downtown vision, the alternatives tend to kind of build into what the city wants to ultimately see at the site. So our final recommendations, since we were focusing on the financing, we of course wanted to recommend that a market study should be conducted prior to finalizing any decision. About 9 to 12 years ago, when developers were looking to build over the Mass Pike, construction costs were estimated for developing those air rights at about $400 a square foot, just for construction. So developers were claiming that they needed to build 35-story buildings just to break even. So that being the case, if there isn't a strong market for the air rights at this site, and if the construction is going to be that costly, we think that the city should pause and consider why it is that there haven't been so many redevelopments of air rights outside of downtown Boston. But one of the things that the city should consider and not rule out is a phased approach. There's been a lot of talk about South Station, and that particular project has taken over 30 years in order to be realized. And it first started with stabilizing the station and then bringing in the bus transit terminal, and now finally they're looking to work with a private developer over the air rights. That would require careful engineering, but we think that as long as the city takes into account any future growth that could happen on top of any parking garage that gets built or any stabilization of the station, that it is possible to approach this in a phased way. So we just want to say thank you for learning more about Quincy Center than you ever thought you wanted to know, and open it up for